Hello everyone, I'm Brian. Today I'm reacting to Adhyasa Bhashya 1, Swami Ananda. So there's three parts to this. I'll do part 1 on this rotation with Swami here, and then part 2 on the next rotation of his videos, because it's a little over an hour long for each one. So anyways, I'm not too sure what this is. So let's go ahead and get started.
So we're going to start classes on Adhyasa Bhashya, the commentary on the Brahma Sutras written by Adi Shankaracharya, the introductory essay. Not the commentary itself, not even the Brahma Sutras themselves, but the introductory essay written by Adi Shankaracharya, one of his most famous works. Adhyasa Bhashya. Bhashya means commentary, and Adhyasa means superimposition. But what that means, we'll look at it. It's really important for students of Advaita Vedanta. So that's one reason we're taking it up. So we'll have a class on Adhyasa Bhashya, not a detailed one, because that would be really vast in itself. Maybe we'll do that later sometime, revisit it and study it in depth. But just what we can manage in the next few classes. All right. Now I'll start with a chant. So when the Brahma Sutras are studied, monks, they start with this chant. Om Narayanam Padmabhavam Vasishtham Shaktim Cha Tatputra Parasharam Cha Vyasam Shukam Gaudapadam Mahantam Govinda Yogindra Mathasya Shishyam Shri Shankaracharya Mathasya Padmapadam Cha Hastamalakam Cha Shishyam Tam Totakam Vartikakaram Anyanasmadgurun Santatamanato Asmi Shruti Smriti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaram Loka Shankaram Shankaram Shankaracharyam Keshavam Badarayanam Sutra Bhashya Kritau Vande Bhagavantau Punah Punah Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavadvyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha. In the study of Vedanta, the fundamental texts are the Upanishads, and in association with the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras. So these three taken together are called Prasthanatraya, the triple canon or the triple foundation, the foundational texts of Vedanta. If you want to study Vedanta, you need to study these three texts. And there are endless other texts, but they're all derivative from these three. And among these three, the Upanishads are primary. The Upanishads, as we know, are a collection of spiritual philosophical teachings from the Vedas, the larger corpus of the Vedas, which form the root text of Hinduism. In them, the vast bulk of those texts are ritualistic. They pertain to various kinds of sacrifices, which are not our concern here. Vedanta, literally the end of the Vedas, the highest teachings of the Vedas, the final teachings of the Vedas. In Sanskrit, Siddhanta, the final highest conclusions of the Vedic teachings. That's called Vedanta. Where do you find it? Obviously in the Vedas, but where in the Vedas? In the texts called the Upanishads. And in our Vedanta study circle, we were studying the Upanishads. We have already studied the Mandukya Upanishad with the Mandukya Karika, and we have just completed the Kathopanishad. The Upanishads are called Shruti Prasthana, the foundation based on the Vedas. Vedas are called Shruti, that which is heard, that which is literally that which is heard, that which was revealed by God to the sages, and from the sages, rishis, down to us. So that is the Shruti. Then there are other than the Vedas, all other religious texts are broadly called smritis, literally that which is remembered. Smriti, literally that which is remembered. Now, the Bhagavad Gita, forming part of the Mahabharata, is also a smriti. It's a section of the Mahabharata. So the Bhagavad Gita is also is a smriti. And the Brahma Sutras, which we are concerned with today, they are called Nyaya. Nyaya literally means logic. There's a school of Indian philosophy called Nyaya, but in general, Nyaya means logic. In Indian languages now, Nyaya also means justice. So these three texts.
Real quick, so he said it can be understood as logic and also understood as justice. Has it ever been confusing? Because I mean, to have one word with two completely different definitions could be confusing. I guess you'd need the prior wordings to understand the context of that word, what it's used as. But that's kind of, I guess, something like in the United States, or not. I want to say United States. I mean, like in other languages as well. I think I can't remember my native language too well. I do not think there are one word that means two different things necessarily, but like I guess an example would be like read and read. They're spelled the exact same way, but the way you pronounce it is different. So is that the same thing with the word there? Let me rewind that real quick. Naya? Anyways, yeah, is there two different pronunciation but spelled the same? And then I could, at least then, I can understand, because again, it's kind of like read and read. I believe it's spelled the exact same way. It's just how you pronounce it. I read the book. I will read the book. So it goes back to the few words before the read word or the read word, whether you pronounce it read or read. But yeah, it's a word that's spelled the same. Could be confusing if you just say, oh, read, is this past tense or present tense? Like, well, it depends on what the word before it is, And again, just trying to ask if there's like some type of confusion there, like if it's clear, generally speaking, if you mean justice, or sometimes do you mean logic behind it?
Logic. In Indian languages now, Nyaya also means justice. So these three texts, Upanishads, which are actually a collection of texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras, are the Prasthanatraya, triple foundation. They also have special names. The Upanishads are called Shruti Prasthana, the foundation based on the Shrutis. The Bhagavad Gita is called Smriti Prasthana, the foundation based on the foundational text based on the Smritis. And the Brahma Sutras is called Nyaya Prasthana, the foundational text based on logic, reason, philosophizing. They serve different purposes. The Upanishads, the Shruti Prasthana, are the root. They are the basis for everything in Vedanta. Vedanta, one of the definitions of Vedanta is Vedanta Nama Upanishad Pramanam. The source of spiritual knowledge called Upanishads is literally another name for it is Vedanta. However, the Upanishads themselves are revelations. They are poetic. They are, they are often cryptic. And how do you apply them in life? A worked out set of spiritual instructions, methodologies, paths, all of that Krishna does for us in the Bhagavad Gita. So he is drawing upon the Upanishads. Sometimes in the Bhagavad Gita, he literally quotes the Upanishads. He quotes, for example, from the Katha Upanishad. Drawing on the Upanishads, he designs this wonderful manual of spiritual life, the Bhagavad Gita. And it is justifiably very popular. If you have to take one book from Hinduism, a representative book from Hinduism, it would be hands down the Bhagavad Gita. But remember, Bhagavad Gita itself is derivative. Its authority comes from the Upanishads. In Hinduism, it's interesting. The authority does not come from God. The authority of Krishna the Gita is not that it was taught by Krishna. The authority of the Gita is behind Krishna stands the Upanishads. He is quoting from the Upanishadic authority.
Real quick, so I was going to ask this a little bit earlier, and he talks about how this information was passed down by God to the rishis. And now he's saying that, in Hinduism, or that God is not the authority, but the Upanishads, and Krishna pulls his authority from it. If I heard that correctly. But so when he says God, who is this God? Is it Brahma? Is it Vishnu or Krishna, or like I don't know. I don't, because I sometimes always hear a lot of the different swamis and gurus that I watch, they refer to God, but who is this God? Whenever they talk about Krishna, they generally say Krishna. Whenever they talk about Vishnu, Brahma. But God, it's just, again, is it like the Christian God? Obviously, it's not. But God, Christians call God. But like they say God. Like, who is this God though? Like, I'm not familiar. I don't know who is the God. Is it the God? Too, I'm just wondering. Like, I've heard it said many times, but I've never understood who it is. I know, if I remember correctly from the past videos I watched, Brahma, I believe, is supposedly the god of this universe, because there are many Brahmas out there, and it's like, and I believe Vishnu showed Krishna the multi dimensions of this, of the multiverse, I suppose, where he saw, I believe Brahma's the multi-headed god, and in this particular story that Sadhguru talks about, he got so mad at Brahma that he cut off the fifth head of Brahma. And then, I believe he went to Vishnu and talks to Vishnu about, like, how can this happen, or something. It's been a long time since I heard the story, but he talks to Vishnu about it, and Vishnu reveals to Shiva about the many dimensions of the world. There's only, I believe, one Vishnu, one Shiva, but there are many Brahmas, because each of the Brahmas are in charge of each of the universe that they're in control of. In one universe, they explain that this one Brahma has like so many heads, and then another universe there's maybe one head, or in another universe there's 5, there's 4, there's 3. There's any number of heads. I don't know what the heads represent, but just the different varieties of universes and the different varieties of Brahmas there are. So is Brahma the god that he's talking about here? Also, did I get the story right too? I'm trying to remember.
Now, the Brahma Sutra, the third part of this foundational text, is called Nyaya Prasthana, the philosophical part of it. What it does is, it takes the same Upanishads and thinks about it philosophically, because when you read the Upanishads, lots of questions will come. There are a variety of terms. It seems to say so many different things. What is the central message of the Upanishads? What do these various terms mean? How do you harmonize the various Upanishads into one coherent philosophy? And then the teachings of the Upanishads, what to establish the non-dual Vedantic teaching. Then you remember there are many schools of Hindu thought, all of which acknowledge the authority of the Vedas and of the Upanishads, but they give different interpretations. So you have to defend the Vedantic interpretation, as against the other Hindu interpretations, like the Sankhya, the Yoga, and Purva Mimamsa, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, all of which acknowledge Upanishads as a source, but still you have to establish. But that's done by the Brahma Sutras. Also, there are many philosophers, many thinkers in ancient India who did not accept the authority of the Upanishads. So you can't quote, you can't say this is said by the Upanishad and therefore you accept it. Buddhists, the Jainas, the materialists, they don't accept it. So you have to use logic, just sheer reasoning, to counter the positions of thinkers and philosophers who don't agree with the Vedantic conclusions. That's also done by the Brahma Sutras. And also Brahma Sutras arranges the various practices found in the Upanishads and the ultimate result. What is the goal? Yes, moksha is the goal, liberation is the goal, but what's it like to be liberated? What's the point of all of this? All these issues are discussed in the Brahma Sutras.
So I'm assuming the Brahma Sutras is a very good introduction to all of this. That might be the first step to, if you were to get into it, to read the Brahma Sutras first.
Upanishads, we know they came from a variety of rishis, a whole range of spiritual teachers. Bhagavad Gita came from Sri Krishna. So whom did the Brahma Sutras come from? They came from, the author is Badarayana Vyasa. Now in tradition, sometimes this Badarayana Vyasa is identified with Veda Vyasa, very famous name in Hindu thought, Veda Vyasa, the one who arranged the Vedic corpus into 4 collections of texts, the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, Atharva Veda. He didn't originate those texts, but he organized it. So that's legendary. He's also the author of so many wonderful texts. Notably, ascribed to him, like dozens of huge works are ascribed to him. The Puranas, the Bhagavata, Mahabharata, and whatnot are ascribed to him. So is it the same Vyasa who is the author of the Brahma Sutras? Traditionally, yes, but according to scholars, again, they will say there were 2 Vyasas, or many Vyasas, in fact. So Veda Vyasa may be one person, and Badarayana Vyasa may be another person, or they may be the same one. But anyway, if you want to know who's the author of the Brahma Sutras, it is Vyasa, Badarayana Vyasa. What are these sutras? They are the systematizations of bodies of knowledge. So at one time in Indian thought, very ancient, long way back, long after the Vedas are the source, but then there's the age of philosophy. And at the beginning of the age of philosophy, you have the sutras, where these bodies of thought were systematized and collected into, cryptic aphorisms. So it was one way of compressing data. In modern computer science, you have the zip files. So zip files is we take a lot of data, many files, and then pack it into one, which saves the space. But the problem with these zip files is that you can't use them directly. You have to unpack them and then use them. You can't read them directly. Similarly, the sutras, they contain an entire system of thought into very short, very packed sayings, aphorisms, but they have to be unpacked. And when you unpack them, they give rise to this enormous, elaborate system of thought. So at the root of the schools of Hindu philosophy, you have sutras. Traditionally, the 6 schools of Hindu philosophy, Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Purva Mimamsa, and Vedanta. So the Brahma Sutras are the Vedanta Sutras, the sutras for Vedanta philosophy. Since we are all students of Vedanta, they are sutras for us. If we want to know, a reasonable, coherent, philosophically well thought out presentation of Vedanta, you have to go to the Brahma Sutras. And just by the way, although I haven't taught it till now, hopefully I'll get around to it in a more systematic and thorough way sometime later. But just so that we know, you can't claim to be a student of Vedanta unless you've studied the Brahma Sutras. You can't say that I studied Vedanta. Yes, you must study the Upanishads and of course Bhagavad Gita, but Brahma Sutras also. Otherwise, you can't claim to know the philosophy of Vedanta. You can't say, I did Drigdrishya Vivek or listen to a couple of YouTube classes, so I know Vedanta. No, you have to study Brahma Sutras. So for example, when we become monks, sannyasis, it's sort of taken for granted that you have studied at least the first 4 sutras of Brahma Sutras. I'll come to that, how many sutras are there, but first 4, it is, there's a name for it, Chatussutri, the 4 sutras. Chatu means 4, Chatur, 4, Sutra, Chatussutri. So 4 sutras. So they will just ask you, so have you done the 4 sutras? That means the first 4 sutras of the Brahma Sutras. How many sutras are there? Before that, just a little bit. So there are sutras for Nyaya, the Nyaya Sutras, which are the basis of the elaborate, very complicated, very sophisticated system of Indian logic, Nyaya Sutras. So the author of the Nyaya Sutras was the sage Gautama. So Gautama Sutras or Nyaya Sutras, that's one. Then there are Vaisheshika Sutras. The author for the Vaisheshika Sutras was the sage Kanada. So he gave the Vaisheshika Sutras, which has formed the foundation of the Vaisheshika school of philosophy. Then there are Yoga Sutras. Those are very famous. thanks to the proliferation of yoga schools across the world, especially here in the United States, even if those who are stretching and grunting and huffing and puffing in yoga studios, they don't study Yoga Sutras, but often the instructors are interested. So the instructors, the teachers, many of them are interested in learning a little bit of Sanskrit, and so that they can study the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras were composed by Patanjali. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Those are pretty famous, and they are studied extensively all over the world. Probably most famous of all the sutra literature. Then there is the Sankhya system is a little unique that way, because the original Sankhya Sutras, which probably were composed by the sage Kapila, who's at the source of the Sankhya, the most ancient of all the systems. Even Buddha studied the Sankhya under his teachers before he went on his own, then he became the Buddha. So the Sankhya system is the oldest, and Kapila, the founder of the Sankhya system, Vivekananda calls him the first philosopher of the human race. But unfortunately, the Sankhya Sutras are lost. We don't have the original Sankhya Sutras. There are Sankhya Sutras. If you search, you will find them. But they are a much later effort to reconstitute the Sankhya Sutras. They are not original. So those who study the Sankhya system may not actually even study the Sankhya Sutras. They study the earliest available texts, something like Ishvara, Krishna, Sankhya, Karika, and so on. Anyhow, just enough for us to know that there were some original Sankhya Sutras at some time. And then there is the Purva Mimamsa system, which is the system of Indian philosophy, Hindu philosophy, based on the ritualistic portion of the Vedas. So all of them accept Vedas as revealed scripture. But the interesting thing is the Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, all of them, they only give lip service. Yes, the Vedas are holy and all that, but we'll do our own thing. We'll think freely. They're more free thinkers. When you come to the Purva Mimamsa, they are Vedic scholars par excellence. They base their entire system as an interpretation of the Vedas. So Mimamsa, the word Mimamsa in Sanskrit means Pujita Vichara, which translates into reverential inquiry. A reverential inquiry into the Vedas. What today would be called hermeneutics, interpretation of a text. So they were experts in interpretation of the Vedic texts, trying to find out the meanings of those ancient Vedic utterances and how they could be used for Vedic rituals. So that was another system, huge system. They have a sutra literature, and Purva Mimamsa Sutras were composed by the sage Jaimini. So Jaimini Sutras are Purva Mimamsa Sutras. I think more than 2,000 sutras, much bigger than the Brahma Sutras or Vedanta Sutras. And finally, we have our text, which we're going to talk about today, which is the Brahma Sutras or Vedanta Sutras. They are the sutras for us students of Vedanta philosophy. And they were composed by Badaraya and Adhyasa. So this is the big picture of the sutra system of systems in Indian philosophy. Now, what did they do with these sutras? They wrote commentaries. Remember, these are very cryptic, very short sayings, and very difficult to find out the meaning. So they have to be expanded upon, explained. And so commentaries were written, explaining the meanings of the sutras. Now, the interesting thing which happened to the Vedanta was multiple masters came and wrote multiple commentaries on the same texts, the Brahma Sutras. And therefore gave rise to several schools of Vedanta. So Adi Shankaracharya comes along 1400 years ago, and he writes an extensive commentary on the Brahma Sutras. Just a little bit about the sutras themselves before we go into the commentaries. So the sutras, the Brahma Sutras, they are 555 sutras. 555 sutras.
Okay, before he explains that's always been the issue, especially when he was talking about the zip file, because even in computer, there are different types of zip systems, and they have their own unique zip code, in the type of zip instructions, I suppose. But there's also I believe a universal zip system that every Windows 7, perhaps even Mac, can use to zip and unzip. It's a universal code. But yeah, so it seems like in terms of how he used to zip, I guess the sutras were zipped in a particular way, and now they're trying to unzip it, but they don't know how. And what I mean by that is like how it's meant to be interpreted, because it's so much information and such a dense, so much dense information in such a short maybe sentence or paragraph. And he's talking about how there's so many different interpretations of it. And this reminds me of what Swami Teramadanda says, is that the best thing to do is to, well, if you don't know, was it Sanskrit, I believe? Best to learn Sanskrit and go to the original source and read it, interpret it for yourself. And then perhaps find a school that interpret it very similar to the way that you did, and listen to them, because maybe they interpret it slightly differently and it may make better sense for you. But I mean, this is very difficult stuff, especially if you live halfway across the world, to try to study the I don't know if there's online pictures or books for the Vedas or not. It would be great, that way people across the world have access to it, as well as it's a way of preserving it just in case it's written in stone. Material stuff is going to erode, same with the internet, but generally speaking, the information on the internet is kind of recycling itself. But yeah, to read the original Sanskrit and determine the interpretation for yourself. But don't assume that your interpretation of it is completely right, but at least you have the source and you know the source, I would say.
Little story, not very edifying, but funny enough. But funny enough for maybe Indians from a certain generation. It works like this. So a monk told me this story, and it's a real story. He was in our ashram in the Himalayas, in an ashram called Mayavati Ashram, established by Swami Vivekananda in the 1899. So there, this Swami, of course, was much later, not in 1899, contemporary, much more senior to me. So he told me this story that one day in the ashram there, which is dedicated to the study of Advaita Vedanta, a very senior monk was visiting, very senior monk of the order. And he asked the monks of the ashram, tell me, so they gathered together for discussion and study late in the night. It's in the Himalayas, it's very cold and cozy, and late in the night you gather around a fire maybe and talk. So the senior monk asked the assembled monks, tell me, what is the duty of a monk? What is the duty of a monk? Now, I'll try to translate this. This monk, who is a bit of a wit, he answered wittily in Bengali. I'll try to translate into English. Sadhur kartobbuki, what is the duty of a monk? That was the question. And this monk, he replied immediately, 555 Shevon, Paracharcha. Paracharcha means, literally if you say Paracharcha, it means criticism of the others, backbiting, talking behind their backs, being a gossip. And 555, this is something that only Indians of a particular generation will know. There was a cigarette brand called 555. So literally 555 means it's a way of saying that smoking 555 cigarettes. The senior monk was outraged. He said, why are you being so flippant? You think this is funny? And then this monk said, Swami, if you permit me, I will explain. So paracharcha, literally it means, para means the other, but it also means the transcendent. So dwelling or discussing the transcendent, you can interpret in two ways. One is discussing, gossiping about others, or discussing the transcendent, paracharcha. So that's the duty of a monk, first duty. And second duty, 555 Sevan means not smoking the 555 brand of cigarettes, but the 555 sutras of the Brahma Sutras, to contemplate those 555 sutras. Then the senior Swami was very pleased with him and said, "You're quite the wit." Anyway, wow. So there are 555 sutras. You might think that's a lot, but for example, there's the grammar sutras of Patanjali, which is of Panini, which is even bigger. As I mentioned, the Jaimini Sutras of the Purva Mimamsa system, that is more than 2,000 sutras. So these are much bigger. Still, it's quite big, about thrice the size of the Yoga Sutras, 3 or 4 times the size of the Yoga Sutras. 555 sutras divided into 4 chapters. So Brahma Sutras have 4 chapters. The 4 chapters are I will explain the meanings. Samanvaya, chapter 1, Avirodha, chapter 2, Sadhana, chapter 3, Phala, chapter 4. So Samanvaya means harmonization. So to remember what these Brahma Sutras are, they are all dwelling on the Upanishads. So the first chapter deals with how do you harmonize the sentences of the Upanishads, the texts of the Upanishads, and arrive at a coherent philosophy. So that's the objective of the first chapter, that all of it teaches you that you are Brahman. It's all about Brahman. It's ultimate reality, and it teaches you that you are Brahman. You have to show that. You have to argue it out. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter is Avirodha, that is non-contradictoriness. You have to show that this philosophy that you're setting forth, that Brahman is ultimate reality, and you are none other than Brahman, which is the Advaitic way of interpreting, that you have to establish that this is the correct interpretation of the Upanishads, not what the Sankhyans say or the Yoga philosophy says or the Nyaya philosophy. The Nyayikas and Vaisheshikas are pluralistic. The Sankhyans are dualistic. But you have to establish that non-dualism is the correct interpretation of these Upanishadic texts. And there you have to argue against a group of thinkers, spiritual teachers, philosophers, who believe in the Upanishads and the Vedas, the Vedic schools, Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Purva Mimamsa. But you also have to argue against a group of philosophers, various schools of Buddhism, Jainism, and so on, who do not believe, who do not accept the Vedas as a source of knowledge, as authoritative. So how would that make a difference? When you are arguing against a group of thinkers like the Hindu schools who accept the Vedas, you can always say that the Vedas say so, this is the meaning, and therefore it is done. Because you accept the Vedas and I accept the Vedas. All that remains is to show which is the correct interpretation of the Vedas. But the Buddhists, for example, you can't say the Vedas say so, therefore it is true. The world is an appearance of Brahman.
Real quick before it explains about the Buddhist argument, but the problem is that the fact that there's so many schools and so many interpretations of it, I don't know for sure how many schools or interpretation of the Vedas there are, but I'm assuming, and maybe perhaps some of them, that you cannot just go up and this is the way the Vedas is supposed to be interpreted, because I'm sure their school would probably say the same things, like, no, this is how it's supposed to be interpreted, because our school has read the Vedas many times and taught deeply on the interpretation of it. I don't know. I'm sure perhaps there are many schools, and I don't think you can just go up to one school and say this is the right interpretation, because I'm sure most schools, hopefully, study the Vedas and have how they best interpret the Vedas. But I'm sure there may have been some schools where they have said, yes, you know what, that actually makes more sense. But I have a feeling perhaps a lot of the schools maybe have interpreted fairly strongly, and have evidence to back it up with other scriptures in the Vedas, I suppose. But yeah, and that's kind of always the problem, especially when you try to read something that's so old. It becomes, and especially if the original writer, died, or even if they were to pass the knowledge along via the books and via the words, eventually, just because we're human beings, we end up interpreting it in such a different way than what it was originally meant to be sometimes. And this reminds me of Swami Tadamananda talking about these ancient schools where they've always, don't quote me on what he said, but it sounds like these schools have always learned the same way because this is the way they've been taught. That way the teachings is always consistent and always the same since the starting of the school. It doesn't change just because maybe someone else interpreted it a little bit differently, because this is how it has always been interpreted and this is how it's always been taught to them. So this was the original teachings. But then you have 12 rishis that went out. I believe was it 12? Or I can't remember how many went out. But then you might have that many different interpretations of the Vedas.
Who says? If you say the Vedas say so, and I can show you how the Vedas say so, Buddhists say that leaves me unmoved because I don't believe in your Vedas.
Yeah.
You have to show through reason, through logic. So these various thinkers are there. Those are the arguments against those thinkers. A lot of debating goes on. That's the second chapter. Then the third chapter deals with various spiritual practices, which will take you to the goal, the realization of Brahman. Now you might think, that's the chapter for me. You will be disappointed because many of those practices there deal with the Vedic karma and upasana, which are sort of outdated, outmoded now. Nobody performs those, nobody knows how to perform them. They're mostly theoretical discussion, mostly, not all of them. Some of them are very important. And even when they're discussing spiritual practice, the approach is a more academic, philosophical inquiry into those practices. Not actually step-by-step in how-to instructions. Those are different texts. Then finally comes the phala, the fourth chapter, which tells you about the result, which is moksha. What is this moksha? The sequential liberation, krama mukti, sadhya mukti, liberation here and now, jivan mukti, liberated while living in this body. All of these things are discussed. That's the end. So this is the Brahma Sutras. 4 chapters, 555 sutras. And each of the chapters is divided into 4 sections each. So 4 chapters, 4 sections each translates into 16 sections. And each of the sections has topics. Topics. They are called adhikarana. Adhikarana means topics. So each of these topics, usually they take up one Vedic sentence, for example, one Upanishadic sentence, and then they debate about it. What's the meaning of this Upanishadic sentence? There is a Purva Paksha, which means an opponent who gives some other meaning. And then we come in as Vedantins and we give our meaning. And then we show that our meaning is logical and should be accepted. So this is how it goes.
Alright, actually I'm going to pause right here. So, I mean, I don't think I can say too much. This is mostly a learning lesson, although I have said a few things. And let me know again about who is this God. I believe all the Swamis and Gurus, or at least most of the Swamis and Gurus, talk about God, but generally speaking, when they talk about Vishnu or Krishna or Brahma, they very specifically say their name. But then there's this God, which I don't know who that is. Let me know. Anyways, it's my reaction to, oh boy, Adhyasa, Bhashya. I know I said that last part wrong at the very least. Hey, if you like my content, please consider subscribing, thumbs up, thumbs down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next vid.